Mate, I'm so fascinated to talk to you because I have been a listener of your work, both on your pod, but an avid listener of you speaking on any topic and finding it so intellectual and so outside of my depth that it felt only natural.
It sounds ominous when you say that you listen in on me not only in my pod, but also in my private life,
in your
presumably,
private life, yeah.
trailing around behind me,
your whole
tapping my phone.
Yeah,
exactly.
You're
outside my front door with a little glass next to your ear, just listening in on my private conversations.
If I didn't, would I be well-researched enough for a podcast?
That is the kind of commitment I like to see, young Bradley.
Exactly. But I'm so fascinated by what you do. And the first time I ever come across you, which I like to recall with any guest, because I think it's interesting to start with a reference point, is I am an avid listener of Modern Wisdom, who isn't, in 2024, and Chris has done a great job with his pod, and I see this title for the latest episode that comes out, Has Gay Pride Gone Too Far? And I'm like, whoa, that feels really taboo to talk about. I wonder what this person has to say. And then I'm fascinated by the fact that someone who is Australian, that I hadn't heard of up until this point, is on this podcast discussing a topic that I think fairly relates to your life experience. You're a married gay man with children. Who would be more qualified to have a take that is a little bit controversial or taboo compared to what most would say in modern society?
Right.
Did it feel uncomfortable to bring that up and to potentially write that article at the time?
No, it didn't. I mean, I knew that I'd get shit for it because I'd already got shit for it, and it had been one of the contributing factors to my departure from the public broadcaster. Not that I was punished for it in any way, but they wouldn't allow a particular article to run, and that was a red flag for me about my ability really to work under that particular management structure. This is not a knock on like the public broadcaster in general, because I think historically it's actually been really good at fostering a diversity of ideas, and I think in the future it will be again. But in this particular climate that we've sort of seen, I guess, between the beginning of this decade, really just in the past 5 years, there's been a confusing sort of social justice reckoning that has been quite dogmatic about enforcing the particular ways that you're supposed to think about minority rights, right? There's a right way to think about racism, and there's a right way to think about sexism, and there's a right way to think about gay rights. And it's very difficult for people, it's impossible essentially for people outside of those communities to critique the kind of narratives of there being, structural oppression that we have to fight against. And if you're not anti-racist, if you're not really trying to turn the dial up on the way that we notice race and emphasize sexual difference and express pride in our sexuality and kind of hook ourselves to the wagon train of like where the future is going, if you're not on the right side of history, if you're not an ally in exactly the way that the kind of LGBTQIA plus organizations want you to be an ally, if you're not an ally in exactly the way that this specific kind of university-educated, mostly white academic vision of oppressor versus victim when it comes to either Indigenous issues or, migration or anything like that, then it's almost impossible if you're not part of the minority community to critique that without being perceived as a right-wing fascist blowhard, right? If you're inside the community, it's at least you have some standing to be heard. And the only minority communities in which I have standing to be heard, in which people can't say, well, you're just mansplaining to us, is the gay community and to some extent the Jewish community, because my grandparents were Holocaust survivors. The Jewish community now is not perceived by anybody as being a disadvantaged community despite 5,000 years of oppression because of all of the horrible stuff that Israel's doing, right? So that basically it's like open season essentially on Jews not having standing as a minority that's worthy of protection from discrimination. But on the gay issue, yeah, I do think that all I was doing was noticing that there was a community within a community of people who just feel like maybe the way to find greater self-expression and to flourish more is to turn the volume down on difference and to turn the volume down on identity and to turn the volume down on shoving in everybody else's faces how much they have to be on board. This was at a time when, just to give people background, I had a radio show on ABC, the public broadcaster, in Sydney, which was fabulous, and I was working with fabulous people, and I had a fabulous team, and I felt very supported. And Sydney was hosting what's called World Pride, which is like they have, I mean, I hadn't heard of it until Sydney hosted it, but all of us, as soon as Sydney was awarded World Pride, everyone had to pretend that it was this thing that everyone had always celebrated, and known about. It was like, oh my God, we finally got World Pride. Everyone was like, what the fuck's World Pride? You don't know you homophobe for not knowing that every 2 years, one city is selected to have the big gay pride thing. Okay, great. So Sydney already has one of the biggest gay and lesbian festivals in the world in the form of the Gay and Lesbian Mardi Gras, and Gay Pride was scheduled to be at the same time as this thing. And the public broadcaster, the ABC, was the official broadcast partner of World Pride. And I wrote a piece which the Sydney Morning Herald, which is the big broadsheet in Australia, wanted to publish, which was basically just saying, will there ever come a time at which aggressively asserting our pride in this particular aspect of our identity is actually counterproductive to the ability of young people to just sort of screw around and fuck around a bit and play around with their identity and figure out who they are. Because my experience growing up was that I knew that I liked boys and I knew that I liked girls, and yet all I really had to choose from in the 90s was like either you're straight, which means you're actually a masculine male, or you like have a certain way of walking, a certain way of talking, a certain way of dressing, a certain way of voting, a certain way of dancing, a certain way of thinking, and it involves high heels and it involves, sitting astride a giant inflatable penis that goes down Oxford Street once a year. That wasn't me, which left me in a bit of a conundrum, right? And it doesn't strike me as particularly constructive to require that every time a 15-year-old wants to explore the possibility of being intimate with a member of the same sex, you're going to require them to open up this whole Pandora's box of identity issues that are going to have to make them question whether or not that means something fundamental about who they are and who their community is.
Is that a disservice to people who are
Well, it was for me.
Yeah.
It was for me. And the ability to simply say that it was for me, and to say that if it was for me, it probably still is for some other people, is an enormous taboo. So, they wouldn't let the article be run because the claim was that this was me, a public face of the public broadcaster, taking a position on a controversial cultural issue. And we don't do that. We don't take positions. Now, at the same time, every single other show, all of them hosted by straight hosts, is celebrating how fabulous Mardi Gras is, how fabulous Gay Pride is, how fabulous World Pride is. Every second guest is someone representing World Pride. Every second promo on the network is about, tune in for our live coverage of World Pride. You walk into the lobby and there are gigantic rainbow flags flanking the lobby. And the broadcaster is the official broadcaster of World Pride. So of course you're allowed to have an opinion about a controversial cultural event. It just has to be management's opinion. It has to be management's opinion, right? Now, there has since then been a change of management at the ABC, and I think that is now changing. But at the time, in this kind of 2020 to 2023 period, there was just a real sense, and it wasn't just at the public broadcaster, it was everywhere, and I think everybody can kind of feel it, that like talking about things like gayness or, I don't know, let alone trans issues or Indigenous issues or migration or feminism or Me Too or these were things that if someone had a strident opinion about it at an office party or at the pub or at a barbie, everyone's assholes would pucker up just a little bit and, everyone would get uncomfortable. And that's why I created Uncomfortable Conversations, because I was like, stuff this, I just want to be able to talk about these things without worrying about whether it makes people uncomfortable. Not to make the guest uncomfortable, but just because I think that in order to survive the 21st century, humankind is going to have to talk about important things in a way in which we're not constantly self-conscious about treading on eggshells and not triggering tripwires and things.
Well, it's so fascinating you say that, because I love the slogan of your show, a safe space for dangerous ideas. I think that's absolutely brilliant. I didn't actually know this at first when I started listening to your pod. And just through further investigation, I think it might be in your Instagram bio. So I really dug deep. I seen that slogan and I thought, that's fucking brilliant. But it's funny you say it, because I believe at the start of this year or the end of last year, I can't quite remember the date, a really good mate of mine, one of my best mates, is a very talented cinematographer. And over the years, he's done a lot of work for Mardi Gras and for the organisations behind it. And last year, he needed just a second pair of hands on set to move lights. And I was in between jobs. And he's like, I'll pay you a cashier to come up and help me for 2 days in Sydney. I'm doing a massive promotion and cinematography piece for Mardi Gras. And I was like, yeah, sweet, I'll come up. So we go up to Sydney. It was in Balmain or Leichhardt, somewhere like that, in this big warehouse. And I walk into the most colourful fucking warehouse I've ever seen in my life, right? And I'll actually show you a video after. There's a great video of me sitting atop of a glittery pink unicorn with an incredibly sunny, angelic, heaven-like set behind me, testing the lighting.
I love it.
So I feel qualified to have this conversation with you today, right?
Yeah.
But I still remember being there amongst this incredibly lovely group of people who were all like going out of their way to make sure that we felt really comfortable. And I'm pretty sure us and then maybe one of the other photographers there were the only straight people on set, right? Because as any community, like it's full of its own people who are working hard to bring this together, and a lot of them are working as volunteers. But I still remember the whole time I was there being very sensitive about anything that I said.
Of course.
Because we were experiencing some like very visual images of stuff that I'm like, you would not see this every day. Like guys on their hands and knees with like dog masks on and chains around their necks being pulled by like 2 lesbian women on a fucking Harley Davidson is not what I had on my fucking bingo card for today. But I'm experiencing it and I don't know how to commentate on it, right?
Yeah.
And I found it so uniquely different, but dangerous to make any comment or be surprised by anything.
Yes.
I was worried about offending people.
Yeah.
And it makes me think about, if we can't have uncomfortable conversations in modern society, how does society, politics, anything that feels particularly taboo actually move forward?
Well, it doesn't. I mean, and don't get me wrong, I love the fact that guys are putting on dog masks and being led around on chains by lesbians. Like, you do you, brother. Like, whoever, I mean, you want to go out and have a big party for Mardi Gras? Fabulous. Absolutely. I'm very libertine and I'm very libertarian culturally, and people should be allowed to do whatever they want to do. But just don't insist that I be part of your group. Don't insist that because I am married to a man, I must parrot what your team tells me to parrot. And certainly don't try to punish people or get them fired or excommunicated for screwing around with different ideas and like trying to spitball different ideas. I mean, those conversations that we have to have, like the 21st century is going to be full of big challenges like climate chaos and artificial intelligence, and social media is already doing our heads in. And the only way that really democracies work, and the only way that Enlightenment principles and, you know, traditional kind of tolerance for other people's ideas work, is if you have some sort of common ground that you can talk to each other on, where like there's a baseline sort of acceptance of like, I'm going to be roughly generous towards what you think, you're going to be roughly generous towards what I think. I'm not going to immediately prejudge you as being from another tribe. You know, we're going to agree that there's like a baseline agreement that we all sort of have standing to be part of the conversation. And so let's try to figure out where we agree rather than constantly jump down each other's throats about where we disagree. And something's happened like in the past 5 to 10 years where it's just, I mean, I think social media has a lot to do with it, where our worldviews have become extremely strident and blinkered, and half the population thinks that the other half of the population is absolutely nuts on a number of really important issues that we're going to have to come together on. And so I sort of see my job as, I definitely don't see my job as being a both sides are. Like, I don't like the idea that centrism is always the best solution. My point is not that if you have someone who believes that I don't know, climate change isn't real, and then you have someone who believes that climate chaos is going to be a problem, that what you should do is just like find the dividing point between the two of them and try to be a nice conciliatory centrist so that everybody should get along. There are things that are true and there are things that are not true. The planet is warming and we know that certain gases trap heat more than others, and we're putting those ones into the atmosphere, and that's going to have disruptive effects, and that's going to be really expensive and really annoying to have to deal with this century. So let's try to make it less expensive and less annoying to deal with, right? Like, I don't think that is just a fact. And so, but there are a lot of things that are not just facts. There are a lot of things that are opinions. And we saw this. I'm not just going to pick on the LGBT issue here, but if you talk about the voice referendum, for example, I was on the air during that, and there was a lot of what sounded to a lot of Australians like quite finger-waggy, judgmental sort of, just get on the fucking train. Just get on this train. We're doing this thing. It's fucking obvious. This community's been shat on for hundreds of years. Like, stop asking questions about whether or not putting it in the Constitution is the right way to do it, or, whether or not this or that, or how many people, how much it's going to cost, or how many people it's going to... Like, shut up and be on the right side of history. No one's going to come along if you just tell them to shut up, because you know what the right side of history is. You have to persuade them what the right... I voted yes, but you have to do the work to explain to people why. And we're not very good. We're getting worse and worse at talking to each other in ways that are maximally generous to each other. And so I kind of just want... I feel like if my show can just help people to have 10% more empathy towards a position that they previously thought was beyond the pale, then I've kind of done my job.
Well, I think, if I can compliment you for a moment, I was saying to the boys before you got here today, and for those listening by the boys, I mean the producers who are in the studio here, that I think your best skill set on your podcast is your ability to challenge someone without disrespecting them.
Right.
And I think if your job...
Well, thank you. That is the goal, yeah.
Well, yeah. I think if I was to give you, you said there, what is my job? That being the posing question of having these kind of conversations, I would say it's to be an example of that. To teach other people how they could potentially challenge points, ask deeper questions in the effort to deeper understand and allow themselves to educate themselves and progress in society. You would be a great example of that for people. And, it's so interesting. You bring up the point here around... I guess people feeling uncomfortable having those conversations, and then things like the voice referendum. I was speaking about it last night with my partner, saying it's so interesting that we voted yes, but I still was a little bit confused about what I was voting for and what the whole thing was about. I made an educated decision as much as I could with the information I had at hand, that I don't think voting yes moves us backwards. Right?
Yes.
And as someone who has family history, friends, people... in my circle who are Indigenous, I thought this feels like the right decision to make.
Yeah.
But I'm not quite sure what every piece of the puzzle is going to look like moving forward with whatever result happens, because it felt so confusing. So I think education is a huge part of any kind of progression, right? And it makes me think about, we spoke there about the LGBT community, and I don't know some of the other acronyms.
QIA plus. In America, there's Two-Spirit because of the First Nations people who apparently had Two-Spirit. So
it's all very labeled,
it'll never end.
It's all very labelled. Yeah. And I think that's part of maybe the problem, because it feels like it... I don't know, maybe for some people it makes them feel like they have a greater sense of identity. I can't speak to that. As a straight male, I can't speak to... feeling like my identity.
Why is it important to have like this whole identity thing, right? It comes back to what you were saying about whether you have a plan for your life or not have a plan for your life. Some people think it's very important to have a plan for their lives. I just don't. Some people think it's very important to feel like their identities are paramount, and I just don't. The majority of people in the majority of places throughout most of history have been deeply connected to a sense of identity. And in most places, at most times, that identity has caused tribal disputes, warfare. It's caused imperialism. It's caused complete misunderstandings between cultures, massive cultural clashes. The history of humankind is a history of groups of people who felt very important, who felt that it was a very important part of their individual identity to be part of a community, to be part of a tribe, to be part of a race. It's where racism comes from. It's where sexism comes from. All of those things, identity is fundamental. And there was a period, I guess, between the middle of the 20th century until the second decade of the 21st century, when the progressive left became basically on board with the idea that identity is corrosive. Identity is dangerous. You don't want to inflame identity. You certainly don't want young males to start thinking about their identity because they're the most dangerous demographic in the world. Young males will burn the world down if they get a chance. So you want to make sure that you're not, just turn the cool things down when it comes to being proud of your identity. White pride is not a good thing, and nor is black pride if you're in an environment in which there isn't overt racism. If racism is taboo, then this whole question of identity, like Martin Luther King Jr. was very clear, like judge people on the content of their character, not on the color of their skin. And that was regarded as being the goal. That was the light on the hill. That someday, in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and 2000s, the goal was that someday we would look at skin color with as much relevance as hair color or eye color. And we would treat each other with love and compassion as individuals. Obama was probably the last prominent person on the left to articulate that worldview with any power. Because when social media came along, and we can go into all the reasons why this might be, some fairly bonkers ideas that had come out of universities, some sort of post-structuralist ideas about how everything is actually power relations between people, right? It's sort of old-fashioned and fuddy-duddy and naive to think about individuals as being the main unit in a society. Actually, society and culture are groups of warring factions, and they will always use their power to try to get on top. And what's actually happened over the past half century, this narrative said, was that privileged white straight males have invented this idea that, everyone's just equal. We shouldn't regard people on the basis of their identity, but that actually just serves their benefits. No, I'm sorry. Historically, they entrenched their power through their identity. They entrenched their power by excluding Jews and blacks and women from positions of power. And all of a sudden, the left in the past decade, thanks largely to this kind of university-educated clique and the kind of derangement that's happened from social media, has somehow encouraged everybody that identity is a great thing as long as the right people, i.e. the historically disadvantaged people, are the ones who get to think about their identity. So let's turn up the volume on identity. Let's talk much more about race. Let's talk much more about sexuality. Let's have much more pride in our gayness and so on. That's all very well, as long as you can ensure that the only people who are proud of their identity are the worthy ones, the trans woman of color. But at some point, white men are going to start, if you impose that hard enough, are going to start saying, well, why are we the only group that doesn't get to identify as an identity group? That doesn't get to fight on our behalf? And that's why you've got Andrew Tate.
I was just going to say
the same and that's
thing.
why you've got Donald Trump, and that contributed to Brexit, and it's contributing to the rise of the far right in Europe. There's only so far that you can push your worthy cause before the people who are disadvantaged by your self-righteousness push back and go, hang on, what the fuck about us? Like, are we part of this demos? Are we part of this country as well? Do we get a vote about how things should go? So my call is for a sort of a more compassionate understanding of us as individuals who are dealing with each other as individuals rather than as icons of like an identity group. I mean, this reminds me of the first time that I noticed this happening. I was living and working in New York, and I was a host on HuffPost Live, which was this experiment in doing a talk show, like a 12-hour-a-day, television talk channel out of Manhattan. And there was an Asian American activist who was a young woman in her early 20s who was trying to get Stephen Colbert pulled from the air. I think this interview is still on YouTube if people want to look it up. Because Colbert had satirized an some racist, and he'd done it in some way that she felt was demeaning towards Asian Americans. But it was a satirical point. And I interviewed her, and halfway through she just starts saying, well, I completely understand that, as a white man, you feel entitled to talk down to a woman of color. That's what white men have been doing for centuries. So it doesn't really surprise me. And I was like, hang on. I don't... the fact that I was born with balls and white skin doesn't mean that we can't have a conversation about what satire is and what's appropriate for it to allow on television. She's like, well, I understand that you feel entitled to talk over me, as white males do, and feel entitled to talk over women of color. And I was like, that was the first time I noticed that, okay, this is not two humans having a conversation. This is two representatives of identity groups trying to score a win for their identity group against each other. That's what she's doing. She's not talking to me as a person. She's talking to me as some kind of cardboard cutout of white manhood. And she's a cardboard cutout of woman of color. And we're just blabbing slogans at each other about power and oppression and who feels entitled to do what. That was like a canary in the coal mine for me, and that has become very widespread, I would say, and it's a cause of why so many conversations do feel uncomfortable for people, because they've been sort of indoctrinated to feel like their identity group doesn't give them standing, doesn't give them the right to be able to comment on whatever it is that whatever conversation is happening. I mean, my attitude is we're all in this together. The world is either going to succeed or fail with all of us or without all of us, right? I mean, we're all going to hell or we're all, going to keep muddling along. So we have to figure out a way to do it together rather than being like, well, you don't get to talk to me about the way that we talk about this subject because you're not from the identity group that I'm from. No, I'm sorry. I do if it has relevance to the whole of society. That's like we're all in this.
It's so interesting because I often think, would the world be better if we just didn't label anything? And when I say better, would we be more collaborative? Would we have better progression? Would we exist in a space where people feel less of a victimhood and less oppressed because there's not a label placed on their situation or who they are? Do you think we are going in that direction of labeling everything too tightly, that we're actually going to create greater division long term?
Yes, but I hope we can avoid it. And I mean, I want to be clear here. There's an obvious critique of this, which is it's all very well for the white man to talk about how, everyone's too focused on their identity. Like, walk a mile in the shoes of a woman of color and then tell me that we're too focused on identity. I get it. I own my privilege. I understand that perspective entirely. But I would just say that the way that we have the best things that have ever happened to everybody, including traditionally disadvantaged communities, has been by trying to target need to where it is most needed rather than privilege people on the basis of their skin color or sex or gender, which means that, I'm fully in favor, I'm a lefty, I'm fully in favor of, aggressively trying to give people opportunities when they don't have opportunities. But those policies should be targeted on the basis of who actually doesn't have opportunity rather than who belongs to a particular category. So yes, I think there is a big challenge of labeling ourselves. Can you imagine a world, it sounds almost comical now, but imagine a world where we just didn't even think about race. Well, imagine a world where skin color was like hair color. And of course there would be culture. There would be ethnicities. You'd have traditions, or nationalities. You come from a Sri Lankan family, so you like a particular food. There are still religions, so you're still, if you're a Muslim, you do certain things, and everyone gets along. But the kind of ramping up of an antagonistic, battle-ready sense of we need to be fighting for our fucking rights. There comes a point at which that becomes corrosive and actually alienating and not the best way to win over the people who you actually do need in a democracy to win over. You need people on your side. I mean, and just one last point on that. By definition, if you're a minority, you need the majority to empathize with you. Right? But we've kind of had this weird logic lately where it's like people who claim, I don't want to say minorities because most minorities don't feel this way. When you actually talk to the Sri Lankan or you talk to the Muslim in southwest Sydney, they haven't bought this whole ideology. This ideology is coming out of universities and it's mostly white people who are peddling it, right? But this particular social justice sort of orthodoxy, this dogma that I'm talking about, seems to assume that you can kind of shut everybody up as long as you are on the right side of history, and the right side of history is being defined by this minority group, by whatever minority group you're picking. They just fail to notice that at some point the majority is going to have to agree, because if they don't, the majority is going to vote in the Trumps and the Pauline Hansons, and is going to start listening to Andrew Tate.
Well, it's so interesting because you just said there, imagine a world in which people don't think about race, religion, colour, any of these things that are, identified as labels for groups. There is a world. It's called childhood. As a child, when you grow up without anybody telling you otherwise, you walk into the schoolyard for the first time and you pick your mate because they smile across the room at you, or they walk in your direction, or you walk in theirs, and they're kind enough and they're empathetic enough to invite you into whatever activity that they're doing. And I grew up, and my two closest mates at school when I was really young, one of them was Singaporean background, so he had a different skin complexion to me, different skin tone. He had a little sister who was in my little sister's year, and we were all best friends. And his family looked different than my family, and we had different backgrounds, but it didn't matter. None of it mattered because he was my mate.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, you go through the world and you start being told by other people that in fact you are different.
Yeah.
Right? And so then people start to think different things. And God forbid you grow up in a family where there is some kind of racist views around the privilege that you should have as a white person, or that you're told that, people of colour do this, and there's people who have done this terribly who are from that religion. And you hear all of these kind of horror stories from usually places where there is less of a minority, right? But I think it's really interesting that does exist.
Totally.
But it changes over time.
I would add to that, analogy. We always go for the analogy of the white household that is preaching racism to the kids, right? And that has traditionally been the worst example of racism. Certainly was up until the middle of the, even the end of the 20th century. Jim Crow laws in the States, segregation here in Australia, stolen generations and so on. In the 2020s, now, right, living in the world we live in, not the world of historical disadvantage, but the world we live in, are you more likely, if you just throw a dart at a dartboard and select a random Australian white family, to find a family that is raising a child and teaching them that black people are inferior? Or are you more likely, if you throw a dart at a dartboard of, say, Muslim families, to find a family that teaches their daughter that women should obey men, or that Jews are a bit fishy? Or if you throw a dart at a dartboard and it's a Chinese Australian community, are you more likely to find a family that's quite openly racist towards Koreans and Japanese people? Or if you throw a dart at a dartboard and you find a group of lesbians, let's say, at the pub, are you more likely to find them casually denigrating men and talking about, oh, stupid bloody men and male pigs and male privilege and whatnot? Let's just be careful about the way that we think about casual discrimination, right? I'm not saying, oh, boo-hoo-hoo, it's so hard to be a white man. But I'm saying, if you don't want white males to act out, and we know that when white males act out, civilizations burn to the ground because they're extremely testosterone-fueled and dangerous, then you have to have some acknowledgement that we currently live in an environment in which it's open season on some people and it's not open season on other people. I would carve out a slight exception here on the trans issue because I think trans people really are copping it really badly at the moment because there's such conservative backlash against the gains that they've made lately. But basically, it's taboo. If in every other sort of forum of polite society in Australia, go to any pub this may not be true in some remote parts of Australia or something, but just think about your experience of living, if you live in a big city, if you live in Sydney or Melbourne, think about your experience of just going out and about, going to the movies, going to a pub, going to a restaurant, hanging out with your mates. How much open racism and sexism is there from white males? It's taboo. It is much more taboo than it is in any other community. You are much likelier if someone says, oh, bloody Asians, coming in and swamping the country, that person is much likely to be called out by their friends than any other community saying the reverse. So
can I make a good point here, right? Because I think you are bang on. Right, I had an incident. I work in Wollongong boy. I know you Sydney-siders frown at that.
No, I love the gong.
The gong's great, right? But one thing we definitely have a problem with in the gong is we have a drug problem, right? There is a certain part of Wollongong that is heavily affected by drugs, and it tends to be around the methadone clinics where we see bad addiction to heroin and ice and these kind of drugs that really destroy people's lives. Now, I have been so privileged to grow up in a great family where I had a dad who was a copper, pop who was a copper, who were very much do everything you can to help people who are in positions of need, right? And my mum and my sister both like really empathetic, loving people. So I grew up loving all different people in my life and like love the women in my life and wanted to look after them and, love the way that my dad, the amount of times me and my sister have been at Woolworths and my dad's chased someone for being rude to a staff member out of a Woolworths is insane, right? And so I'm at work the other day and we work in our office is in a spot that tends to get a little bit of riffraff around it, right?
Right.
I'm walking down to an
Not
appointment.
downtown LA riffraff,
No,
but,
downtown Wollongong riffraff.
Yeah.
And walking down the street, headphone in, where I hear just like a scream, like a bit of a wailing scream. And I turn around and watch this woman running in my direction, probably 100 yards away, being chased by like a tall fucking dude. Like absolutely chasing her at full pace, grabs her by the ponytail and just reaps her back. And I'm like, fuck. And just the way that I've grown up, first instinct is run in her direction.
Yeah.
And then he sort of takes off. Long story short, we end up getting in a bit of an altercation because I put myself between them where
Good on you.
he's sort of trying to swing at me.
Yep.
I end up de-escalating him. We get him charged. All that sort of stuff happens. He ends up apologising to me a couple of weeks later. I've seen the bloke every day since. I've never seen him in my life before.
Wow.
Really interesting, right? But they were both drug affected and they left 2 kids in the middle of the road to go on this domestic fucking adventure. And the thing that disappointed me the most, right, is I looked around after I was in a physical altercation with this guy and watched probably 20 other people, and I'm talking 20 amongst them, a good group of guys, who stood behind the door of their office, poking their head out, looking in my direction as I tried to do the right thing. And so part of me feels like online, these conversations are amplified, but in real life, where these situations unfold, are people brave enough to then call it out? Because I'm sure that all of those guys would agree that domestic violence is wrong, right? Or at least 99% of them, right? You'd like to think.
Yeah.
The conversation then becomes, I don't think any of them should have to put themselves in front of someone who's particularly violent, but strength in numbers.
Exactly.
Right? So I'm happy to make that call for myself. But if all of a sudden all the 10 guys within 20 metres of me decide to come out and stand as a tall, fucking open and united front, then all of a sudden we've got a de-escalated situation.
Well, and if you want to really blow your brain about the question about the difference between what people say online in order to signal how good they are and how worthy they are to other people versus what they actually do, it'd be an interesting study to figure out if those guys who fail to help are likelier to be the sorts of people who profess their solidarity with feminism or likelier to be traditional blokes. Because in part of the conversation about sexism, I think we have this caricature that traditional masculinity is brutalizing and violent, toxic masculinity, right? And what we need young boys to understand is like that, they've had it good for too long and that it's girls' turn now and that they should take a back seat and they should learn to suppress their emotions, they should learn to not act up and so on. All of that may be very worthy. the greatest generation, the generation of the Great War, basically, people who are now either very old or just died, these were not. Of course, there would have been, widespread domestic violence in a way that we would now find unconscionable. But these people had very traditional ideas about masculinity, and they were very chivalrous people. Like, they were guys who, if they found themselves in that situation that you were in, all of them would help.
Yeah.
Right? Every bloke born in the 1920s comes to help that woman. For sure. Now, do they express the same ideas about gender and sexism and masculinity and femininity that would land as being progressive and pro-woman amongst the university-educated kind of feminist class at the moment? Of course not. They would have really old-fashioned retrograde ideas about masculinity. They'd be like, oh, women need protecting. And nowadays, we'd be like, that's awful. You're part of the problem. It begins with a sexist comment and it ends with a dead woman's body. Well, maybe it doesn't. Maybe it begins with a sexist comment and the old bloke who has the sexist comment feels really protective of women. And maybe there's another bloke who is in it for the likes on Instagram and is talking about how much of an ally he is, like, with women, and just can't understand, like, the brutality of men. It's just beyond him, like, how awful men are, who would cower in the hallway and not help a woman.
Yeah.
So all I'm saying is Twitter's not real life. Like, social media's not real life. The way that we talk about sort of minority rights and, like, social justice at the moment is not real life. It doesn't always map on. And when we talk about privilege, I own my privileges, but really the kinds of privileges that have been the most beneficial to me are not the ones that are part of the conversation about privilege. It's not really that I'm a man. I'm 6 foot tall. That is if you look at how much people earn, there is a direct correlation between how tall people are and how much they earn. If you're a man who's 5'2", you reliably, that cohort of males reliably earns less than people who are over 6 foot.
Is that just averaged out by NBA players, though?
No, you can exclude the NBA. There are all kinds of other privileges. I mean, I was born middle class. I was born into a family, we weren't rich, but I was never aware of us having a problem feeding ourselves. But we don't talk about class privilege very much. I mean, we sort of, we pay lip service to it, but we don't really take seriously just the kind of the difficulty that people have when they have financial impediments, regardless of their race. There are all kinds of. I mean, you could go through an entire list of the ways in which privilege works, and you could have a highly articulate, well-educated, middle-class black woman who is far more privileged than a working-class bloke who has no education. I mean, that's just a fact, and that reality does not currently factor into the way that we're supposed to talk about things. And on your point about children, I think it's a really good one. I just had a great American woman, Stephanie Lepp, on the show. People should listen to Uncomfortable Conversations, obviously, if you think what I'm saying is interesting, and you can hear her episode. And she talks about children as well. And I made the point that a lot of people will say that children are racist, that, like, children are cruel. Like, you go to a playground and they'll say things that sound racist, right? A child might say, he's got funny slanty eyes about an Asian kid, right? Like, or your skin looks like you were burned in a fire if you're a black kid, right? But the point is, they're actually... those things are only racist once you learn about race and about taboos. They're not meaning them to be racist. Now, they might be picking on a kid, but they're going to find something to pick. Like, if there's a kid who's in the out group, they might pick on a kid because he walks funny. They might pick on a kid just because they don't like him. They might pick a kid because he eats funny. They might pick, whatever it might be. He's not good at sport or whatever. And if you're a different race, then maybe they'll pick on that. But the things that people think that they hear which make children racist are actually usually things that we have learned to be racist because that's the way that we think. They're just talking about people's skin color or shape.
It's very true. It's very true. Their intent isn't to be racist, or their intent isn't to be provocative in most cases. It's just kids point out the obvious.
Right. You got to sort of learn to be an asshole about your tribe. And what we've done lately is we've forgotten that being super tribal is actually the asshole move. We now think it's the noble move.
Yeah, arseholism is learnt.
Yeah.
Do you like that? Is that a
I
word?
like it. That's a good one. Arseholism is learnt, yeah.
We'll add it to the dictionary, the Urban Dictionary.
Yeah.
That
Well,
is.
maybe some arseholes are born. There's a particular type of arseholism, which is my group gives me the right to tell you how you need to think about anything that might relate to my group.
Yes.
And that's what's learned.
That's learnt. Can I ask, because I think this is really interesting where this conversation is headed. We're talking about the fact that everything is a little bit over-labelled. Everything is maybe in some ways, it's almost like in some ways the progressive culture is mansplaining everything to everyone, right?
Right.
To make it maybe more challenging to have these conversations and move forward in a collaborative direction. But I think about kids at school right now, and I think it's a challenging time to have a conversation around the environments that kids are being educated in. Because as a 28-year-old bloke who, yes, middle class like you, Josh, yes, is privileged from my colour of my skin, my head goes, I'm really empathetic that if somebody was growing up right now, or an adult that existed in a body they were born in, that they didn't feel like they should be in, that'd be a really fucking challenging way to live. I'm so blessed that I feel really good about who I am, body I was born into. I'm blessed enough that because I am straight, I can love my beautiful fiance and not potentially feel nervous about going out on a date and being seen because it's different or considered progressive. I love that my life is fairly easy because of who I am, right? But I can have the empathy to go, man, if you're not me, if you're maybe wired a little bit differently, if your sexuality is something you're considering and you haven't quite figured out yet, or you think that maybe you exist in a body that shouldn't be yours and you'd like to be a different gender, wouldn't be an easy way to live, right? Wouldn't be an easy way to live until you've confronted that and become comfortable with it. But then there's part of me that thinks, we're educating kids about this stuff from a really young age in school, but are we educating them or are we confusing them? Because for a 6-year-old to be confronted with pronouns, for a 9-year-old, and I've heard of schools in my local area where there's kids who identify as cats and they've now got kitty litters in the classroom. For a 9-year-old...
That might be social media bullshit though, right?
I've heard there's 2 schools in my local area.
You heard?
I heard.
Where did
right?
you hear? Where you sound like my grandmother on Facebook.
Grapevine, right? So I'm just throwing it out there. But for kids to be within this environment right now, are we actually educating them or are we confusing them?
Well, it depends what we're talking about. I think that we're currently in a moral panic about trans issues, and I am skeptical that that children are exposed to as much pro-trans nonsense as we think they are, because I think there's a right-wing push to just cynically manipulate this issue. There'll be one, and social media contributes to this, right? There'll be one classroom somewhere in Canada where like some extremely ostentatiously sexualized trans, female teacher with gigantic boobs, which is one thing that I saw, was, teaching a class and like asserting all kinds of radical, gender nonsense. And that goes viral and everyone freaks out. And similarly, the thing about cats, I've heard that in the States, there were, people identifying as cats and they put kitty litter in the corner of a classroom. I'd be skeptical. I'd want to see that.
Yeah.
I'd really want to verify that. That sounds like bullshit. And if it's not bullshit, then I hope it's just a temporary fad that people can push back on. I think the bigger challenge with any kind of sort of social justice movement is to think about whether or not are we trying to tether people to an aspiration of tolerance and live and let live, or are we trying to dogmatically force people to conform to a set of ideas, right? Are we being Stalinist about this, or are we being kind of Gandhiite about it? And what had happened with the trans issue, and I think one of the reasons why we're seeing this really unfortunate backlash is that some minority of, again, hyper-academic kind of university activist gender theory types were pushing an extremely dogmatic vision of gender, an anti-scientific vision of gender, the claim that there really is no such thing as sex, that that XY chromosomes and XX chromosomes are basically irrelevant when it comes to gender. And because there was such pushback against people who started questioning that, and I mean, I have spoken to and interviewed and colleagues with a number of people who lost their jobs from big newspapers just for writing an article saying, hang on, are we actually sure that this is true? They get demonized as being TERFs and so on. I think that's changing. And I think the TERF side, in many respects, went too far, because once they started getting wins, they just started getting deranged by online. I think social media is making everything so much worse, because, I mean, the whole profit model of a social media company is to show you things that are either going to reinforce what you already believe or demonize the things that you don't believe. So it just makes things seem a lot more outrageous than the reality actually is. I think in reality, if you went into most classrooms, it would probably be a fairly moderate attitude towards gender. We should not be. I mean, the pronouns thing is strange, because it's become a little bit like, I think, acknowledgements of country have become a sort of a litmus test which white privileged people can use between themselves to show that they're on the right side of history and that they're better than each other. You know what I mean? It's become untethered. Like, thinking about what is actually going to benefit trans people and what is actually going to benefit First Nations people. Having a bunch of wealthy, middle-class, university-educated white people in a Zoom room at an HR meeting all saying, I pay my respects to elders past and present, while they do fuck all for First Nations people. Yeah. Probably not the best solution.
Yeah, whilst you've never employed a First Nations person
you've never employed them. You don't associate with them. You don't go to the parts of town where they live. You don't care about going and, supporting them in any way, but you're going to do this thing because it makes you feel good. And similarly, the pronoun thing of like, oh, we as a corporation firmly believe in like inclusion, and everyone in our corporation has to put the he, her, or the she, the he, him, or the she, her at the bottom of their email signature, as if this is a great triumph for, trans rights. I mean, all of this it's window dressing, it's identitarian, and, the aspiration ought to be everyone should be treated with respect and nobody should be discriminated against. And actually, I mean, there's a sort of a useful, I think, contrast between the gay rights movement of the 60s, 70s, 80s and 90s and the trans rights movement of the 2010s and 2020s, in that the original gay rights movement was very clever about not making it about sex and not making it about forcing anything on anybody else. They were like, what I was saying earlier about like finding common ground for everybody to agree on instead of trying to focus on differences, trying to focus on areas of agreement. Yes, there were riots, in the 1960s when police were bashing up, gay people because it was illegal. But as soon as there was a forum in which gay activists could speak, what they were saying in the 80s was, we want exactly the same things that you do. We want to not be discriminated against when we try to get a home loan. We want to be able to go and visit our partners when they're in hospital and they're dying, rather than being treated as if we're strangers. Someday we'd like to be able to marry. We'd like to be able to share our finances at the bank. We'd like to not be discriminated against when we try to rent an apartment. These are basic human values. We're not asking you to do anything. And that was really compelling. And the gay rights movement was probably the most successful civil rights movement in the history of the world. I mean, when I was born, it was illegal to be gay. And quite apart from being illegal, it was an absolute perversion. And now, the fact that I'm married to a guy is the most boring thing about me, right? Instead of doing that, the extreme trans movement, instead of saying, we just want to be treated like everybody else, you don't have to change your lives at all, took a policy of, you will change the way that you understand biology. You will say things that you know not to be true about the fact that all life forms basically have two different sexes, and you will deny that. And if you don't deny that, there'll be punishment, and you might get, at best, hounded off Twitter, and attacked and demeaned and vilified, and at worst, you'll lose your job. and you will sign off every email by putting in your pronouns. So it became this very adversarial approach of, instead of saying we want to not be discriminated against, we want the same things that everybody else wants, which I think would have had it. I think the wins would have been swifter, and I think the pushback would have been gentler. I think more people would have come along if you could frame it in universalist, humanist language, than if it was like, you are on the wrong side of history and you have the blood of trans children on your hands for not being on board. That has now triggered a really bad backlash from the right, and I feel terrible for trans people. I have a lot of trans friends who feel really betrayed by their own movement, because now they're having to cop a backlash from right-wing assholes who are being really awful to all trans people just because an activist wing of the trans community went too far.
It's such a fucking fair point. Because to me, the common sense play, and I know common sense is hard to find in one society, but the common sense play is, as a human being, if you can have empathy for the fact that someone should be able to live their life the way they want to live it, and provided that they don't force that on anyone else, that's fine, right? But then I have the problem with, like you just mentioned there, great example of that is, I seen a video on TikTok last week of somebody who has transitioned, right? And they're sitting there filming themselves on TikTok live at a cafe or just filming a video. And the very polite waiter walks up to them and says, "Hello, sir, how can I help you today?" And they're like, "Oh my God, you've just misgendered me, you absolute fucking cunt." And I'm like, that's not the words that they've said, but basically that's the energy,
yeah,
right? And
yeah,
I'm like,
yeah.
Whoa,
Yeah.
old mate who's earning an average income
Yeah.
to provide for himself,
Yeah.
who's chosen to go into hospitality, likely because he enjoys people and wants to be nice and wants to give somebody a nice g'day and say hello, didn't come there to offend you.
No.
And the fact that you can't respect that in the process of trying to educate people and move forward and have a progression in society is the problem.
Well, that's right. I mean, it even goes further than that, because in some cases, like, I understand that a person who has transitioned would find it confronting if they didn't pass, so to speak, if they, they didn't look like the gender that they identify as, and so they got misgendered. That would be hurtful. But on many occasions, you have people intentionally trying to look provocative and then getting offended when people are provoked. I mean, I sort of get into arguments with some of my non-binary friends about this as well, who will, like, have a beard, they're born male, you're supposed to say assigned male at birth, as if the doctors have no idea what sex you could be. They just sort of pull it out of a hat, we'll assign this one male. The fact it's got a penis and, and the chromosomes and, the...
Evidence suggests.
Yeah, no, we're just randomly, we'll assign male at birth, that's whatever. But so, we're talking about an individual who has a beard and a hairy chest and has no desire to transition to being a woman because the person is non-binary, but will wear a very big floral dress, for example, and earrings, right, and lipstick, and then go out to a pub, a non-gay pub on Oxford Street, and will feel violated that someone made a remark. Well, isn't the point that you're trying to fuck around with gender stereotypes? Like, aren't you trying to provoke? I mean, good for you. Like, great. Yes, why do women wear dresses and not men? Why are we judgmental about playing around with this? Great. But don't push the boundaries and then cry foul when someone points out that you're pushing the boundaries. You know what I mean?
It's a fair point. It's a very fair point. Hey, I have to ask you, like, everything we're talking about here today, 3 years ago, 4 years ago, you probably wouldn't have been able to have that conversation on mainstream media. Hence
No way.
Your transition and your move, right, into your podcast now. I wonder if you look back at that moment with hindsight, is it potentially the best thing that ever happened to your career?
Sort of being driven out of the legacy media?
Yeah, because at the time, anything that is a massive change like that, there's probably some frustration.
Yeah,
Am I assuming
it's too
that,
early to say. Ask me in 20 years.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, I still feel hurt, to be honest, and I feel betrayed. by a small number of people in the organisation who did not have the courage to say, you know what, we're a big place, we're full of big ideas, we are the nation's broadcaster, we broadcast on behalf of all Australians, and we're big enough to cop whatever shit some tabloid is going to throw at us for being a little bit edgy. Like, it's our job to be edgy. It's in our charter to represent all Australians, not to represent a small clique of university-educated social progressives. And the fact that at that particular point, and I'm not saying this is at all endemic to the organisation, because it really isn't, because there are so many good people there who are really open-minded, but the fact that at that particular point there was like that pressure point, and that the people who could have stood up to it and allowed conversations like the one that we're having now to take place, not in as extreme a way as we're having it, right? But just like half of this conversation, if that could take place, and if people had been big enough to allow that to happen, then I just would have had so much more faith in humanity, I guess, and just in people's backbone. And the fact that I did feel at the time sort of not victimized, but sad about humanity, that there's this great, august institution that is having its founding ideals betrayed by a few cowards who are now no longer there. So that's good. But God, I love not having a job. It's great. Not having a job is the best.
I've played for periods of my life in this full time, and it's a very nice feeling.
Oh, it's wonderful. And look, I mean, my departure from the ABC, I mean, my subscribers doubled the month that I announced that I was leaving, and they doubled again the next month. And so I pretty quickly started earning more from the podcast than the ABC was paying me. I mean, you don't get paid much in public broadcasting anyway. So, it's a huge relief, but I still love, like, legacy broadcasting. I really do. I just wish that this level of communication could also take place in the old school, because I fear that the old school will die if it doesn't.
Speaking of jobs, Donald Trump recently gets a job at McDonald's.
Yeah.
How much of a play and a change will that make in the election process? Do you think it will impact the way that people vote?
What, the Macca's thing?
Yeah.
Nah.
You don't think?
What do you think?
Well, I think it's so interesting. I was chatting to the guys out in the office here before, saying there's a gentleman that I come across last year who was actually on Chris Williamson's podcast named Brian Klaus. He wrote a book called Fluke, right? And a big part of what Fluke's about is about chaos theory and how these seemingly insignificant events can change the course of history forever.
Right.
We really don't know, though, until we look back in hindsight.
Right.
Right. And there's some great stories in the book where there's examples of this. He gives an example of a former Secretary of Defense in the US who goes on a honeymoon to Kyoto, Japan with his wife. They fall in love with the place. It's the most magical thing they've ever experienced from the moment they step off the train. They love it. They enjoy every day of their 2 weeks there, and they return home until 4 years later, we're ready to drop an atomic bomb. I say we, as the US.
Yep.
They're ready to drop an atomic bomb in Japan. He finds out that Kyoto is one of the 2 destinations that they're targeting. And in a moment of divine fucking inspiration, he absolutely flocks in to try and get them to change their mind on where they drop this atomic bomb, because Kyoto holds so much sentimental value to him and his wife. And he convinces them to change where they drop this bomb. So the fact that hundreds of thousands of lives hinged on one guy's romantic honeymoon 4 years ago seems like quite an insignificant event that turns out to be actually quite significant in the course of history.
I love it. Yeah.
It makes me think about these little moments that, we're coming up to the US election, these little moments like Donald Trump at a McDonald's. Apparently he's on Rogan tomorrow.
Right.
Kamala Harris on Call Her Daddy. All these little moments that in the scheme of history seem to be insignificant. It's one
No,
interview.
I mean,
It's one job.
I love the Kyoto example. But I think what you're missing is that the whole premise of like the fluke worldview is that you don't know at the time that it's happening that it is so
Correct.
consequential, which
But I
means
need
you
you to
can't
predict,
tell.
Josh.
So where you can't tell what impact the McDonald's thing happens. I think if there's something like the McDonald's thing or Kamala doing a particular show, then that's unlikely to be the pivotal sort of flap of the butterfly wings that is the fluke, because we can sort of see that it's a stunt a little bit, like it's the McDonald's thing with Donald Trump for me is perfectly consistent with his brand, which is a disruptor. He's a disruptor. He doesn't give a shit about the rules. He does crazy shit. You don't know what you're going to get. That's his shtick, right? I say what I think, and he's shameless. He's shameless. So doing something like that for me is, it's not going to make anyone who thinks that he's, a dangerous, delusional, authoritarian bigot like I do vote for him, and it's not going to, turn off anybody who was already committed to thinking that he was the better of the two options. But I do like the contingency of history, and I think a certain humility about what we know and don't know is pivotal to my worldview. Like, we're just muddling through, man. I don't know what's right and wrong. That's why I'm just suspicious of people who claim to. Yeah. I'm suspicious of people who are very finger waggy about how they've got the new answer about how everything ought to be, and anyone who disagrees is like these people have been. It's almost an archetype throughout history. I mean, in the 1950s in the United States, the worst thing that you could be was a communist, and so Senator McCarthy had witch hunts and hounded everybody down. And now it sounds, it sounds silly. Why were they so frightened of communism? In the 1950s, it was really fucking scary. It might end the whole system of freedoms that we like. Russia might win. It's like those people thought they were doing the right thing. They were the social justice warriors of their time. They were the censorious people who knew that they were on the side of the right, and you can't make an omelette without breaking a few eggs, so you have to sort of do cancel culture on people who aren't, who aren't on the right side of history. And this just happens again and again and again, from the Inquisitions, the Catholic Church, to whatever. People have a tendency to feel like they have found the right way of thinking about things, and they just don't have time for people who aren't on board with their right way of thinking about things, because those people are just impediments to a better future. And that's the kind of like dogmatic, know-it-all attitude that the left has taken on, which is really unfortunate, because as a lefty, I want the left to be like the party where you go to the McDonald's drive-thru like Donald Trump does, and where like you smash some shit up. When my parents were kids, rather, being on the left meant that you were the revolutionary, that you were the bad guy, right? Like in the 60s, you were doing drugs, you were having sex with everybody. Like the left was fun, and the right was all like me, 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 me. Now the left is all me, 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 and like the right is like, fuck yeah, throw some shit at the wall, say some outrageous things. The left needs to reclaim being outrageous. We need to reclaim taboo, just not caring about taboos.
I like it.
Yeah, just tread on some eggshells. The sky doesn't fall. Fuck it.
I like it. So let me ask you, then, if you consider what history will say about the moment we're living in, what do you think the statement will be made in 20 years' time when we look back on 2024, all of the heat and the conversation that's going into this election, all of the debates that we've discussed today, all of the things that feel uncomfortable to talk about in this moment right now, what will history say about it?
I suspect it will say something that we haven't even touched on yet, which is that this was a moment at which it was the last moment at which humans were not engaging with non-human creatures that were intelligent. I actually think that's probably going to be like in some decades' time what we look back on, in the same way that we might look back on like the 90s as like, that was an era when nobody had smartphones in their pocket. There was no such thing as a selfie. There was no such thing as social media. There was no such thing as like, you just sat down and you watched an old white guy talk at you for half an hour about what's going on in the world. That was where you got your news from, right? Yeah. Or you opened up like a shredded piece of a tree and you leafed through it with ink printed on it and you read about what was going on in the world. that was what was most different about the 90s than the 2020s in many ways.
I don't know if you've seen the story that Today Show covered in Australia.
Which one?
About the AI chatbot and that young man who's 14.
No.
His name was Sol, I think, from Florida in the US, who took his own life. He went on this AI site where you could create a character essentially that you have a relationship with, and then
I played around with those.
This character, through conversation, started to pick up and this is generated by AI. It starts to pick up that this young boy, 14 years of age, is struggling with his mental health, and starts to, through its messages, convince him to take his life so they can be together. And so this young man takes his life, and now his mum is left in the wake of trying to figure this out. And this conversation around, we really haven't regulated this AI thing that much, have we?
Well, no, and I mean, how do you even? And that is just like the tip of the iceberg. I don't think we have any idea what's coming. I mean, we will soon be living in a world that is populated by, I call them creatures, because we will interact with them all the time. I mean, you'll just, you'll walk into your house and it won't be like lights turn on. It'll be you'll be having a conversation with your house, and it will be indistinguishable from the intellectual level of a human being, and it will know way more than any human does, and it will be able to notice maybe from your heart rate and the way that your eyes are moving that you're a bit stressed out, and so it might suggest an Airbnb that you could go to that weekend or what. I mean, you'll have a personal assistant and a doctor and a lawyer and an accountant just in your life around you, not even in your pocket because it won't need to be in your phone. And they will be funny and they'll be personable. They'll be creatures. And that will change things just as much as like if you parachuted someone from the year 2000 into today and they just looked around and they looked at people walking across the street or gazing at their phones. Like, we've become acclimatized to think that that's normal, but it's really quite weird that we are just constantly looking down at these glowing screens. So I think that my big picture answer to the question of like how will historians look back on this era, we're living through the beginning of an explosion of an information revolution, which is going to be as consequential as the Industrial Revolution was, or the Enlightenment, and we don't know how to deal with that. We are like the baby giraffe who's just been born, who's like all covered in placental goo and is like trying to stand up, and that to me is Elon Musk buying Twitter and like Donald Trump getting elected and all of these things that are kind of that feel very disorienting, and the difference between the way people view the Gaza war, for example, like TikTok and Instagram Reels and algorithms, and now the impending beginning of artificial intelligence in a way that's actually integrated into our lives is going to, I think, be looked back on by historians as like, well, that was a big fucking challenge. And it might be a challenge that takes 20 or 30 or 40 years to figure out. Like, so what do we need? How do we need to change the apps and the algorithms, and how do we need to regulate the industry, and how do we need to, just deal? We're just grappling with something. It's like we've just invented nuclear bombs or something, or any other era, like the printing press. When the printing press was invented and people could start reading the Bible for themselves in Europe, there was an 80-year-long war, because all of a sudden people there's a religious war. So we don't know what is going to happen, but I think people will look back on this as like the beginning of a massive change.
Well, as you said, 30 to 40 years where maybe we figure this out. I hate to break it to you, Josh, but you and your husband will be the old boomers who are watching Sky News and quite conservative.
Never. I'll be the old radical. I'll be like the Rolling Stones.
But I wonder, like, how does that make you feel as a father about your two kids who are going to grow up in a world that is so fucking foreign? You're not going to be able to help them because you don't understand it.
I'm a fucking genius. I'll help them. I'll figure it out.
You're one of those guys that you warn me about, the guy that knows all. The guy that knows all.
No, I mean, who knows? Yeah, it's going to... I mean, I already feel the pace of things changing. I already feel like an old man just in terms of the way that I, think about TikTok and stuff. Like, I don't... It doesn't appeal to me to consume information at that pace. And I think it impedes my ability to do things that I care about a lot, like read long books and stuff like that. And so in that sense, maybe I'm a fuddy-duddy, but like I'm a fuddy-duddy who has preferences in common with all of the great thinkers of all time, and I think we will continue to, and the people who excel and who shape thought will continue to value a certain amount of kind of temperance and contemplation and empathy and small L liberalism that keeps them grounded in a universe that is increasingly chaotic and crazy. So when I think about my kids, look, I don't think AI is going to take away everybody's jobs, but people who use AI are going to take away all the jobs of the people who don't use AI. And it's going to change things in a big way. But it's exciting. I mean, we might all end up with our brains plugged into computers in 150 years, living forever. I mean, I'm along for the ride. I'm up for it. I'm never going to be the guy who's shaking his fist at the heavens saying, like, we should be going back to some supposed olden times. The olden times sucked. You know, like you were saying earlier, like, oh, as a white guy, it's a lot easier to live than it is if you're less privileged. I mean, yeah, that's true. You don't have the same problems, but life basically has generally sucked for everybody always. Life's fucking tough. You know, like life wasn't easy for the white guys in the 1800s who were down in the mines, or, for farmers. Farming's hard when you don't have any agricultural equipment. Most people through most of history have either been grinding themselves through poverty, or they've been doing backbreaking labor in fields, or they've been in a factory more recently. Now we are the lucky ones, right? We're living in a blessed life.
The fucking podcasters,
such whiners.
The podcasters, the privilege of being a podcaster.
Yeah, not just the privileged podcast, but basically everybody who's listening to this, almost everybody who's listening to this, is probably in the top 5% of income earners in the world.
Very, very fair.
That's a fact. And in terms of their assets, in terms of their freedom from random crime, in terms of the fact they don't have to worry about law and order. I mean, unless you're listening to this in like a hovel in Nigeria or something, you are probably living in a Western liberal democracy, and you're probably not worried about whether or not you're going to have enough food tomorrow to survive if you really work at it, And that is incredibly rare. And I'd just like us all to have some tiny little bit of gratitude and appreciation for that, and to enjoy the ride. Like, life's short. Just be nice to people. Mate, it's going to be over soon.
Very fucking true. I will say the last closing point, you said before, you spoke about the minority groups that you exist in. You forgot one.
What's that?
You're potentially one of the last men to wear a mohawk with pride and pull it off. Might I say. So
it's mate, not a mohawk. I would love to have a mohawk. I mean, that would be seriously punk rock.
It's
like
got
a
bit
bright
of
green. It's sort of like a faux hawk. Like, if you're listening to the podcast without seeing me, well, I mean, you can always Google me, but I would say it's like a sort of maybe 1995 David Beckham faux hawk.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Fucking bring it back. Can I say something?
Yeah.
It strikes me that, what's really dangerous about a guy like David Beckham?
What?
Is it's very easy to watch David Beckham in his series, the Netflix 3-part series, to follow a guy like that on Instagram, and as a fucking straight dude who's 28, go, I can fucking pull off a fishnet singlet with a pair of jeans.
There you go.
I can pull off a photo.
You can do it.
I can pull off anything that guy wears.
You can, though.
No, and then you walk outside the house and you look like a dude who's having a fucking fight with a fishing net.
It's true.
It's.
But so does he. He just happens to be David Beckham.
He happens to be a fucking handsome looking rooster. Yeah.
He is a handsome looking rooster, isn't he?
Mate.
He could have done anything. I mean, he could have worn anything. It's the thing. Harry Styles can wear anything. He can wear a feather boa. It's fine. Yeah. You or I wear a feather boa outside. We look ridiculous. And also, speaking of my hair, I can't even wear hats because I look ridiculous in a hat. Like, quite apart from the faux hawk. I mean, I have terrible fashion ability.
The old backwards with just the faux hawk sticking out the front. Yeah.
Yeah, I could do it. Maybe I need a mullet. I could do mullet.
A mullet. I like it.
But, like, you know what I mean? Like, you're Harry Styles. You can get away with wearing anything. You're Josh Szeps. Can't even wear a baseball cap without looking like I'm wearing a baseball cap. You know how some people can wear a hat and you're like, hey, and then other people wear a hat and you go, oh, you're wearing a hat. I'm that guy.
Speaking of equality, welcome to fucking my world, mate. So
I feel seen.
Mate, I appreciate you so much. I've enjoyed this. It's fun, and this is typically not the kind of conversation I would have on the pod. These very taboo topics, they come up from time to time depending on the guest, but it was fun for me to riff with you today.
It's great. I loved it. I had a blast. Thanks for inviting me.
You're a good man. We'll make sure that
you.
all the links to your show and everything that you do,
of course,
are in the show description. But the truth is, people don't need them. They know who you are. You're biggest.
Well, if they don't, just Google uncomfortable conversations. And surely there can't be that many of them. Josh Szeps is the name, but it's hard to spell.
Mate, they'll find it.
It's right there in the show notes.
You're a good man. I appreciate you.
You too. Thank you.
Cheers, mate. Bye-bye.